Alrighty, I hope this is working. Alright, so my name is Abigail Tredray, and I'm doing my presentation on Borges's The Aleph and how I think it represents humanity's conceptualization of infinity and also how it inspires art. So, the story of the Aleph is a brilliant tale of human perception and our experience in the world. It perfectly encapsulates the genre of magical realism in that the borders of reality, quote unquote, and the fantasy begin to mix. The concept of infinity is simultaneously unknowable and also utterly complete in Borges's interpretation. And while the Aleph could have easily been written as an out of touch spectacle, incomprehensible to the average reader, Borges took such an incalculable source and wrote a story that just perfectly expressed the human experience and our relationship with the universe around us. So we begin the story with the narrator's lover, Beatrice, who had succumbed to cancer. The narrator, more out of a begrudging politeness and a need to hold on to some closeness to his lover, becomes further acquainted with Beatrice's first cousin, Carlos. Carlos is trying to write this poem, his magnum opus called The Earth. And he's basically trying to cram every single piece of human art and history and everything about the world into this poem. The narrator doesn't really take to Carlos. He thinks he's more of a pompous, untalented poser who uses a bunch of useless analogies to try to mirror some aspect of greatness. Carlos speaks to the narrator about describing the sky as not azure but cerulean, clouds as celeste white to allude to the heavens above, and how each stanza moves from one period of time and with different authors, like with Homer and Hesiod, all of which is utterly uninteresting to the narrator. But one day, Carlos calls to the narrator distraught because he finds out that his house is set to be demolished. He is devastated because he needs this certain spot in the house to finish his poem. It is here in the story when Carlos tells the narrator about the Aleph, a point which contains all other points. The narrator is interested and his interest is piqued, and he rushes over to Carlos's house and follows him into the cellar to see this mysterious Aleph that Carlos is so worried about losing. The narrator lays down in complete darkness, flat on his back, and is told to look for this spot in the corner. Not unlike a sensory deprivation tank, if you kind of know what those are. The following passage, in which Borges writes of the Aleph, is truly one of the best pieces of literature I have ever read. The narrator describes this point of all points as something beyond human language, utterly complete in its totality and far greater than anything beyond human understanding. He writes of Beatrice and how he could see her and the cancer in her breast. He states that he could see every single ant on earth, every single grain of sand. He could see everything that was or ever could be. He saw armies marching, horses running on the beach of the Caspian Sea, his own blood moving in his body. He even sees us, the reader, and he weeps. The Aleph is something that can never be described fully in human words, but Borges finds such a magnificent way to conceptualize, the concept of everything. And after seeing this mirror reflecting every point of the universe, as Borges states, the narrator simply gets up and returns to Carlos, whose reaction is more akin to a child showing off a new toy to a friend. In fact, both of the characters' outward reaction to staring into infinity is so mundane that it's almost required for the reader to suspend their own disbelief. The only thing that the narrator does in response to seeing this point is to pretend that Carlos is crazy just to spite him. And then he returns home. The rest of the story is told through an almost encyclopedic epilogue. The house does end up getting demolished, and thus the Aleph is lost. Carlos does end up winning second place at the Argentine National Prize for Literature. And it's almost like a final joke about Carlos's deficient talent. He had access to this view into eternity, an infinite source of inspiration, in only one second place. But on another hand, you can also see it as infinity being incomprehensible anyways, and never fully being able to be expressed through art. The narrator themselves even begins to disbelieve that he even saw the Aleph, and sadly the story ends with the narrator admitting to himself that the face of his lover, Beatrice, is slipping from his memory as well. So how does this tie into the main point of this presentation? How do people view infinity, and how does it inspire individuals? How does the story of the Aleph perfectly encapsulate the genre of magic realism? So speaking of magical realism, Borges' story of the Aleph fits right into that category. The boundaries between the real world and the mystic become porous. In some cases, it requires the suspension of the reader's disbelief, but the purpose of magical realism is to convey concepts of human experience that cannot be expressed otherwise. Whether they lie beyond the realm of rationality, or if outside circumstance prohibit the expression of such philosophical debate, people might twist reality in order to convey their ideas to the general public. Like in the case of the Aleph, where the need to bend logic is clear. Much of the story is entirely mundane. The narrator lives a rather lonely life now that his lover is dead. He meanders through dull social gatherings with Carlos, only for the chance to stay tethered to his lover. But the story shifts once he comes across the Aleph, and reality bends, and the window into infinity is glimpsed. All the while, the story never loses touch of an entirely human experience. The Aleph gives the narrator a view into the world, and into himself, and those he loved. And at the end of the day, the story ends with a man clinging to the memory of his lover, Beatrice. The story of the Aleph is also an anecdote to human inspiration. The concept of infinity is incomprehensible for human minds. Borges makes that incredibly clear in the story, but it captures people's wonder anyways. It is only natural that it would inspire art as well. Carlos represents the artists in the story. Though the narrator is openly disdainful of him, Carlos is doing something that is entirely humanely natural. Without looking at the Aleph as like a literal thing, Carlos gazed into infinity to draw inspiration for his poem. People gaze into infinity, in a metaphorical sense, all the time. Infinity has inspired surrealist art and also the art of fractals, just to give some examples, and it clearly enthralled Borges. It speaks to the ever-burning curiosity of humans to know that infinity is something we will never truly be able to know, but we still try to conceptualize anyways.